gathering, but since we already have a pretty packed audience here, I will start by welcoming you all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Loretta Yarlow, Director of the USDA. It's been a great honor and a great pleasure to work with Jim Welling on this exhibition. It was his concept from early on to focus our show very precisely on his New England work, done over a 30-year period from 1970 to 2010. And then even more focused, it's really Connecticut, which is where he was born, raised, his formative years as an artist, as a student, and where he continues to come back to do projects. In fact, on his way here today, where was he? In the Connecticut fields, driving up here. It's his source of inspiration. It's his place. So we're honored to have this really precise focus, which is what he wanted for this exhibition. So starting with the earliest work, for many students in the audience, it's refreshing to know that your work saved your work, because Jim's work from the age of 19, these beautiful watercolors shown for the first time, a Super 8 film that he did, which he transferred to DVD, and you can see already in this work precursors to his art practice, his strong abiding interest in landscape, abstraction, and it continues throughout his whole career. And then in that same room, of course, the glass house works done, that's the most recent work, 2010. Also in Connecticut, Entertainment Connecticut, beautiful digital prints. The video is shown for the first time, so a lot of firsts here to show video in the same space as art objects. Not many artists are willing to take that chance. Another wonderful experiment of Jim's, and it works beautifully. And so I see this whole exhibition as a kind of lexicon of Jim Welling. There are key works throughout his career in the North Gallery. Again, the overview of abstraction, representation, landscape, architecture, his working in digital, working with analog. Many students who had a chance to look at the works before, darkroom photography, silver gelatin prints. Here they are. It's a medium that's still viable, it's still very beautiful. Camera-less photographs, the photograms that Jim has done. So this wide spectrum of interest. And I think what's interesting too is that so many artists today want a signature, they want a brand, a definitive work that sort of epitomizes their work. Well, there's no epitomizing work for a Welling, and that's the beauty of this exhibition and the beauty of Jim's career, that it's this amazing depth and breadth. So after this exhibition, 2 days from now, Jim is having a solo retrospective at the Cincinnati Art Museum. We have a book. I was going to actually pull it out just to hold it up, but it's at the front of the gallery. If you'd like to just peruse it, it's just a wonderful overview, exquisite book called Monograph. The exhibition's called Monograph. So in a book you can see what he's been doing for 35 years. Great to have Lorne Falk here to speak with Jim, so you really get insight into what his work is about. I'll introduce Jim in a moment, Lorne and Jim in a moment, but want to thank also people who are involved in this exhibition. Justine Durrett, who is co-director of the David Werner Gallery, who was here this evening very early on from day one. Very helpful and incredibly insightful work that she's provided for this exhibition. And of course the University Museum staff, as always, our dedicated staff. Craig Alvin, our installation manager, Justin Griswold, our registrar, Emma Pierce, education curator, and Lori Coleman, business manager, and of course all of our wonderful students. This is really a team effort to do our exhibitions. So I had known Lorne years ago in Canada, then lost him, found him again. Here he is in the Pioneer Valley. So it's really great to know that Lorne is here teaching at Hampshire College. Lorne has worked in the arts and education for 38 years as a teacher, dean of faculty, residency program director, gallery director, curator, writer, consultant in the arts and education. He's currently a visiting associate professor at Hampshire College, where he teaches courses in contemporary art theory and culture. From 2001 to 2008, he was dean of faculty at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Prior to that, he was associate professor of design theory and criticism at the School of Design, the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, program director at the Banff Center for the Arts in Canada, director and chief curator of the Walter Phillips Gallery, and at the Banff Center for the Arts. And early on, the director of the Photographers Gallery in Saskatoon, Canada. text panel, and all the books and photos we have in the front of the gallery, so you can get insight into his long career, 35 years as a photographer. It was an honor to have you both here. Jim, thank you. And Jim will return. Just one more word to say that he will be doing crit sessions and will be returning to the university at the end of the semester. So this is part of our wonderful opportunity to have Jim. Having been, just recently, he was artist in residence at Princeton. Then he returns to his work as the chair of the art department at UCLA. So a mentor to artists throughout his career. And so we're hoping that there'll be interesting mentorship here at the university. So without further ado.
Thank you. Well, Jim and I just met an hour and a half ago, and I was introducing myself to him and told him I have a degree in biology and chemistry and come to the arts through an artist collective in Canada. And in addition to all those fancy titles that Loretta just introduced me with, Jim just added a new one. He said, "Oh, you're an amateur." Which is but I wanted to ask you, because you're clearly interested in this idea in the context of the art world, art making, the role of art in the world. So let's start right with this notion of amateur. Why this?
I was on a panel last night in New York, and it was about photo education and the kind of proliferation of master's degrees. And there were a lot of art historians in the room, and one of the art historians mentioned that she frequently finds that experts in the field are amateurs, that they are the people who are not bound by, I don't know, the codes of professional codes. So if someone's interested in, she was a film historian, there are amateur film people who know a lot more than the professionals. So it's interesting to think about this in relation to art practice, and I'm sure throughout my entire life I've been interested. I mean, someone might say obsessed with different artists. I research their work. I look at it. It's very important for me to look at books, read about artists, go to shows, and it's not something that I learned in art school. It's something that I almost approach or think about my practice as an artist, as an amateur. And maybe that's when Loretta talked about the lack of a signature style. Maybe I'm more of an amateur than a professional.
And it also, as you say that, it strikes me this idea of you're, in a sense, in search of finding problems and articulating them rather than trying to solve them, which protocols in art history or the methodology in any specialization might be more inclined to do. It's the idea of trying to articulate certain things in your work is something that did appeal to me when I started to really drink it in. Jim and I come to photography at about the same time in the 1970s, and because I know there are a number of teachers and students here, I thought it would also be interesting to kind of frame the 1970s and now in terms of education. So for example, I already confessed that I came out of the sciences. When I got involved in a photography collective, it was at the moment in the 70s when photography was beginning to be embraced by the art world. And I found myself, along with many other people, coming together frequently. And one of the signature places was the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester with Nathan and Joan Lyons and many other people, A.D. Coleman. And we were having this conversation about, well, okay, photography has this huge tradition, this important tradition, and now it's sliding into the art world. So what is the discourse of photography? Does it have to hybridize? Do we have to give it up? Is this a discourse and divorce situation? And on the heels of that, color photography also became affordable for a lot of practicing photographers, and there was a huge discussion around what does that mean for the medium. So that was the context that I, within a couple of years of shifting out of science and getting involved with a collective of artists experienced. The desire of a medium that had been located adjacent to fine art or high art, as it was called then, suddenly becoming fully engaged in it. So I wanted to ask, in a sense, I was a student and certainly an amateur when I joined that collective. You made the move from Carnegie Mellon to Cal Arts at about the same time, and I was just curious what the conversations were amongst students, and what were you thinking as a student about this thing called photography, this medium called photography?
I really didn't think about photography seriously until I left graduate school, and it's I teach now, and I teach graduate students, and would be kind of shocking for me to think of a student abandoning what they've learned in grad school or taking a different tack after they leave school. I was very interested at Carnegie Mellon in making abstract paintings and making very minimal sculptures. At Carnegie Mellon, you had to choose painting or sculpture in your junior year, and that seemed like an impossible choice. I didn't want to choose. So I went to a school, Cal Arts, in California, which had just opened, where you didn't have to choose a medium. You could work in what later became post-studio art, where you are beyond a medium. You use whatever tools you need. And I participated in that experiment for 3 years, and I left Cal Arts extremely dissatisfied. What I didn't understand, it took me about a year to figure out, is that I needed a medium, that I really wanted to have a medium-specific condition. I had made a lot of paintings as an adolescent, and there are some on this wall out here where I was obsessed with, kind of capturing what my eye saw. So I made paintings, different types of paintings, but when I left Cal Arts, painting didn't seem to be an option. I'd worked with photography. There are 2 pictures in the show. They're the first 2 that when you go down the stairs, there's a self-portrait and an obscure photograph of some ice and a tree. And those are pictures that I made before I committed to photography. But I had a kind of life-changing experience when I was 25, when a friend of mine saw my frustration at not knowing what to do after this post-studio art experience. And he said, "Jim, you should get a camera like Ansel Adams and take photographs like Ansel Adams," which was the most ridiculous idea coming out of John Baldessari's classroom, to go backwards in time. It was like Back to the Future. I mulled that over, and sure enough, I got a camera like Ansel Adams and began to take, they weren't really Ansel Adams type photographs, but I began to apprentice myself to the camera. And it was very important. I was lucky that I chose this device, the camera, because as I worked with it, I've been able to unpack it in so many different ways, in ways that I couldn't have imagined when I started. But it was very important that I began with this medium called photography. And the amateur in me was starting to do research in the history of photography, sort of a self-education program. Even though I sat in on a couple of photo history classes at Cal Arts, it was really like after I left school and became obsessed with photography that I needed to and wanted to explore this medium. So it was, and when we were talking earlier, I wanted to make sure that I described this relationship I had with the camera that I bought, because I'm sure all of you take pictures, and when I was taking early photographs before I made this commitment to photography, my pictures always looked like someone else's work. I never thought of it as mine, that I couldn't own the picture because it looked like someone else, or it was just a document. But there was a moment when I remade the medium, and this is like a big, broad claim, but it's what I think about now. It's like every artist has to remake their materials and their medium so that it becomes a personal expression. Of course, photography has certain constraints. I'm not going to go outside of these very basic constraints, but there's a way that in order to embrace something, you have to make it your own, and you have to kind of reinvent it. And that was one of the things that was so exciting at 25 when I began to reinvent photography for myself.
And that reinvention is, as you're talking about it, for me is a really interesting and key moment for anybody who wants to make pictures. I, in the fall, taught a course that was ostensibly to be a history of photography course, and I said I want to teach the culture and idea of photography. Why? Because I think by now, especially in this world of visual culture, there are so many histories of photography that collide that to pick on any one history didn't make sense to me. I was more interested in the culture and idea of it. As I prepared for that course, I came across this fellow from Germany, Wilhelm Flusser, and this little book, Towards a Philosophy of Photography. And he doesn't use very elegant words in it, but his argument is essentially that all of these images that we see every day, whether they are in the art world or in advertising or in popular culture and so on, in visual culture in its broadest sense, are for the most part uninformative. All they do is simply fulfill the program of the camera, and the role of the person holding the camera is actually quite small. But if we're going to actually figure out where this visual culture is taking us, what we need are people who will, in a sense, profane that program, who will reinvent the medium exactly as you described it. And then he says in his sense, what happens is that people like Jim who make the process transparent, who reinvent the mediums and the technology or the apparatus, make informative photographs. There are other people who write about it, the same issue, and they have more eloquent terms, but it's very interesting to hear that for him as a philosopher, this was at issue right now in our world today, and that you as a creative person instinctively understood that this needed to be done.
That's good, because I've never really understood Flusser, so now I've got a handle on it.
But you also said that you had a skepticism about the codes of photography today, and I was curious what you meant by that. And you said there was so much pure representation. That's when you were driving into the desert.
Lorne got hold of an unedited transcript of a conversation I had. Usually when I do interviews, I like to take out all of the bad ideas and crazy comments, but I was just too busy. And so my friend Waleed Beshti and I took a drive to, we were going to photograph trains. I wanted to go to this spot in northern LA County to photograph trains. And so Waleed had a tape recorder, and he got me rambling all over the place. And that, what did I say?
You say, I have a skepticism about the codes of photography today.
Right.
There's so much pure representation.
I was, when I was younger, I was a hothead. And I like to argue, and I like to complain about photography as the transparent window. I mean, one of the great things about photography is that it records what's in front of us, and it creates this Albertian picture. I mean, to my way of thinking, and I think it's borne out by studies and perception, that we don't see the kind of Albertian transparent picture. It's this complicated mental process that our brains create this image that we think we see, and we think it's very similar to the photographic experience. So I love looking at pictures that are purely representational, and I love certain kinds of photographs. but I seem to be incapable in my own work of wanting to just make a transparent picture. I like sort of thinking about the information that one already has when we observe the world, and so trying to make a photograph that has more of my background in it. So it's not just a transparent window, but it has to do with what I'm thinking about, my interests, certain aspects of the camera, of lenses, just trying to make it complicated or dense. In the past, I've also called it like a dense object. It's not something that's just a transparent piece of glass. So that's why, some of my photographs are hard to read, or they're not simple representations. They're abstract photographs, they're photograms. They're just dense things to look at. I want to make a kind of puzzle or something to decode. That seems like an interesting thing to do.
Was that a comment? I want to turn more to your work, but I wanted to just finish up this notion of what was happening in the 70s and now jump forward to this moment. And do you have I'm interested in what your perceptions of what students think photography is now, today, whether there's any radical difference as you understand it, or any difference, or it has changed a lot because of digital technology, to be sure, and the development of so-called visual culture.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask that. I struggle when I'm teaching, struggling to try to teach. I taught beginning photography. It was, it's just a struggle finding cameras. I don't have any global opinions about the state of things, unfortunately. I was on this panel, as I said last night, around problems of photographic education, and it was brought up that Stephen Shore was talking about students who only experience the photography through digital printing or digital cameras. He was teaching in Switzerland, and he was having trouble with the students because they weren't able to really see. So I would just repeat what he says, is that I think there's something about, but actually it's not that. There are two types of seeing. One is just normal seeing, and the other is a more aware seeing. And when I used a 35mm camera when I was a teenager or a young adult, I really wasn't seeing. You can use a digital camera, not seeing. In a way, the problem is still the same. You have to take the medium and make it your own. You have to take responsibility for what you're looking at. And I'm not sure that it's that different in digital. You can still be ignorant when you're using a film camera. And I can certainly say that I was pretty ignorant when I made certain documentary pictures of my sculptures or things that I was working on. So I'm not sure it would be easy to say that things have changed with digital. Maybe it's just that it's the same problem that is an educational problem of how do you see, how do you look closely, and I'm sure that if I was simply teaching straight digital, it would have the same problem. At UCLA, because we're so cheap, that's one of the things about me. I am a cheapskate. I used equipment almost exclusively. I pride myself on my first camera cost $60. At UCLA, we're a state school. We bought a color processor maybe 17 years ago for $17,000, and it's still running. And I keep thinking if I bought computers, $17,000 of computers in 1998, they would be doorstops now. So at UCLA, we still use film, color film. We don't do black and white, and we make C-prints. We have a digital lab, and a lot of students make digital prints, but our beginning classes are through the, still shooting color negative film. And that's the way we like to, get our students working. I also find that a lot of students want to shoot in film. It's exciting. They've done it in high school, and they want to continue, or they've never shot film and they're excited to shoot film. But again, the problem is, that threshold, that moment, and I'm sure for the photographers here who enjoy taking pictures, that moment when you got past the hurdle of f-stops and shutter speeds and all of that stuff working together. There's a lot to kind of work through, and then there's a point when you pass beyond that and you're actually seeing and taking photographs. So there's something really exciting about doing that in the analog world.
In your own work, which is very interdisciplinary, and the photography is often dancing with poetry, or it's dancing with film or text, as in the diary project. There is also a lot of experimentation and manipulation. So it's kind of a follow-up to what you were just saying. Do you find and as I understand your process now, you use both analog and digital processes and often go back and forth. Do you find that digital technologies are introducing new strategies for montage or assemblage, or?
Let's see. Well, I mean, one of the things that I haven't quite figured out with a digital camera is how to make a double exposure. I've been told that some digital cameras will double expose, so I'm working on various techniques to put two images on top of each other. And I started this in the glass house, where I'm superimposing using mirrors and diffraction gratings and pieces of just clear glass, trying to get images stacking on top of each other. So that's a partial answer to your question.
Does anybody here know how to make a double exposure?
A certain digital camera does it. But it's a point and shoot.
Yeah.
So, but it's when one door closes, another opens. So what I love about digital is that I don't have to scan my negatives. The glass house pictures, the 4 pictures here, could not have been made with film because of the need to have immediate feedback to understand what the filters I was using, what the pieces of glass in front of the camera. So it kind of had to be a digital picture, and I've also become extremely interested in the phenomenon of color. And when I first got my Macintosh in '98, I realized that color was a new medium, that I wasn't chained to the darkroom. Even though I still teach darkroom in my own work, I became very excited about the moves that you can make in Photoshop. Actually, let me backtrack, because the glasshouse pictures are all done in front of the camera. It's all filters. I'm not really using a lot of Photoshop. But color opened up for me when I got a computer, and I make inkjet prints, so I'm tweaking the color and working with it. And there's something really material about being able to print the photograph and look at it as it's coming out of the printer. So that's an important difference from the chromogenic prints that I would make. And you have made C prints or even black and white prints. It's a kind of immediate, all at once experience. Whereas with inkjet and digital, it's more cumulative, and you make proofs and you revise and you change things.
So I want to shift the conversation just a little bit from in that wonderful unedited conversation that you had.
Yeah.
You said, and it caught my eye immediately, and I'd just love for you to share more about it. Jim said, not many people or historians put together poetry, fiction, and conceptual art. And because poetry and the poetic is so important in your work, I thought this was an interesting segue to that.
One of the most important classes I took as an undergraduate, probably the most important class, was a class in poetry, and especially in the poetry of Wallace Stevens. So Stevens became a figure, and I've recently looked back at my various books of Wallace Stevens' prose and poetry, and I'm astonished to see how a lot of my ideas just come right out of the things that I was underlining in the Stevens book. For Stevens, the imagination is super important, but he creates this world of images, sometimes very arcane, sometimes very beautiful, sometimes terrifying. It's a seasonal poetry. It's about place. It's extremely vivid. So it's almost like I'm working through some of these tropes that Stevens, brings up. I was also very interested in the poetry of Robert Lowell and his interest in his family. His book called Life Studies was very important, and a very early book of poems called Lord Weary's Castle, which I would always carry with me and read. So for me, I found a lot of inspiration in poetry, but the inspiration was in the fragments, a couple of lines, a phrase. I'd be hard pressed to give a class on any individual poet, but poetry was something that got my mind going and thinking. So it was important to read Stevens and Robert Lowell and Diane de Prima, Anne Sexton, Emily Dickinson.
And then, as you mentioned to me in our earlier conversation, and then to discover that people like Vito Acconci and Dan Graham initially think of themselves as poets,
right.
Before they
the kind of language part of conceptual art in the 1960s comes very close to the poetic. Lawrence Weiner,
yeah,
also started out as a poet.
So there's poetry, and then there's and I confess that I don't read a lot of poetry, but I am interested in what is called the poetics of history, and this brings me to the poetic in your work, which is so very different from the generation that you've been historicized as part of, the pictures generation, which is a very important moment in the story of photography in the 80s. And so many of that community of artists, so many of them were dealing with parody and appropriation and simulation. And when I look at your work, I see the romantic and elements of the tragic in terms of just the idea of living one's life and engaging the world. And how did you find yourself in the pictures generation, just by virtue of being in the same neighborhood?
I was interested in the issues that, I went to school with David Saleh and Jack Goldstein and Matt Mulliken, who were Eric Fischel. I was close friends with Sherry Levine when I moved to New York. I knew Richard Prince, Barbara Kruger. It was like this whole group of people who I think were frustrated by certain things about photography, of a kind of mystical, minor white kind of attitude toward the photograph, a kind of interest in abstract painting or minimal art. So there were a group of artists who were trying to find a way out of the kind of stockade of certain art of the 1960s and its very limited range. And like young artists do, we tried to think of we tried to make new things, make it new, think of new avenues. And I think this is one of the interesting things about the practice of art. I've gone back and forth. Is it important to make it new? Is it important to innovate? And I think, in the last 15 years, if you look at the innovations that, say, Apple or the technology companies have created, the idea of innovation, of course, is important. And I think it's significant that one of the, at times, discredited modes of thinking in an art school is you've got to make something new. Well, that's kind of what the problem is how do you take those elements and rearrange them and make something new. So I've come back to thinking newness is great. I love old-fashioned things. I love antiquarian ideas. I love taking pictures of old objects, but I want to make them new. So there's a way that the pictures generation group I liken it to a biblical story. There's a moment in the New Testament when Jesus comes back. He rises from the dead, and he comes back for 40 days, and he hangs out with his disciples. And then he disappears, and the ascension, all that stuff. And then they all meet, and there's something called the Pentecost, or the Pentecostal Moment, when all of the disciples and friends of Christ start speaking in different languages. This is, of course, it's a fairy tale. But they start speaking in different languages, and they go out all over the world. So there was a sense that when I was in art school, we all seemed to be speaking the same language. We were thinking similar thoughts. But each one of us, following, say, 1975 or 1976, began to work in different media. David Sally took up painting. Matt Mulliken began to be hypnotized. Jack Goldstein made records. Sari Levine was doing photo appropriations, as was Richard Prince. But there was a way that these were all new voices, and they were discovered, and I discovered photography. And my own, track was to take a slightly different path than, say, Laurie Simmons or Barbara Kruger or Louise Lawler with the photograph. But we were all looking for ways out of a kind of confinement that, it was imagined. It was this imaginary confinement that we found ourselves in, being young artists and trying to, get some traction. So that's the way I would locate the kind of the problem that faced the pictures generation, but all generations face this. It's kind of like a Sonic Youth says, kill your idols. So we had to kill our idols. And by killing my idols, it took me about 35 years to come back to Minor White, who I am now obsessed with. Minor White is one of the most interesting artists in photography. It's just that he's a dreadful writer. And I would always look at the writing, and now I'm not looking at the writing anymore. I'm looking at the pictures, and they're amazing. So, I'm not the hothead I used to be. I'm actually now looking at a lot of different things.
My anecdote about Minor White, which I learned from a very important friend in photography in my first 15 years in photography, a fellow named Hugh Hone, who's now in Boston, but had evaded the draft for the Vietnam War and come to Canada, and I met him there. But he worked with Minor White for 2 years and traveled back and forth across the country. And there was a moment when Minor White decided to offload his library, apparently, and he came up with the idea he would only keep 10 books. And if he found a book he wanted, he would have to offload one of those 10 books. I guess he wanted to be on the road. But there was a book by, I think it's Evelyn Underhill, on mysticism, that was one of his core books that he never offloaded.
Right.
And that notion of mysticism, or that ephemeral quality, or that poetic quality, I think it's something that always attracted me to his work. And
the problem, though, with mysticism, it can get kind of fuzzy, and a lot of the work that, in the late 70s, from Jeff Wall to Stephen Shore, it's about a kind of erasure of the ambiguous. It's about a kind of certainty. And I think it was a necessary corrective for photography in the 60s and 70s, which had gotten way too mystical. But of course, I like pictures that look sort of mystical. So I have a love-hate relationship with a kind of materialist view of the photograph, but I also wanted to have a kind of otherness.
When I look at your work, I find myself asking, or having, words come to mind, because I think, in a way, the way you make images brings them to language, and that's the poetic again in them. But I wonder about whether, as I experience some of your work, am I being turned outwards rather than inwards when I'm experiencing the work? And I found a very interesting connection between the very early pieces that you made with tinfoil, where and it's not declared that they're made with tinfoil, and I look at them and I found myself falling into them and exploring worlds. They were water worlds, they were landscape worlds, and so on. And I had the same experience jumping forward to more recent work with the Sun Pavilion video. And I had this, so the way I was thinking about it, which is starting to sound a little mystical, but I loved it, was I wonder if Jim falls into his work and swims in light sometimes. And that was my association with it. And I'm not going to suppose that Jim has that way of relating to the work. But clearly poetic for me, and with a heavy dose of the romantic in it. And speaking of that, I'm interested in also place. Loretta was very eloquent about the importance of Connecticut, and your work is often, this show was situated with New England as a frame, Connecticut as a frame, but it's almost like there's actually a piece of land that you know more than Connecticut that is important, that you return to all the time.
Well, there are two geographies. One is this very specific, maybe 10 acres that I know. I knew as a teenager, and when I was thinking about the show, I changed the title from, I forget what the earlier title was, to Open Space, because this was an open space behind the house that I grew up in as a teenager, which was deeded by the town that nothing could be built on it. So it was this vacant field, which was only in putting this show together that I realized how important that was, and how that took me from my early interest in, say, Andrew Wyeth or Edward Hopper, the watercolors, to land art, art that used open space. So there's that connection, and so this show, we have the early Super 8 film and some watercolors around that 10-acre, it's called Case Circle open space. You can find it on Google Maps. And so there's that, which I really began to focus on for this show, and I've started subsequently to go back, and it's much changed. It doesn't look at all like I remembered it in the 60s. It's forested almost. It's called old growth succession. What happens when you don't farm the land, trees grow up, which is a little disconcerting because the open space has trees on it. There's another body of work on this wall over here in the back called Connecticut Landscape. And those are pictures that I've taken from 1998 until 2007, when I sort of stopped working with a large format camera in favor of a digital camera. But they're my group of photographs when I self-consciously wanted to look at the idea of these spaces that I was not even familiar with. Some I was very familiar with, some I would discover in taking the pictures. So there was this return to a geographic, to very specifically photographing places that I basically knew or passed through or liked in Connecticut. There are a few in New York State, but most of them are in Connecticut. So there are these two different ideas of geography. There's the open space, which I'm actually now pursuing probably as a project to make some new digital pictures of this plot of land. Again, partly inspired by thinking about Joel Sternfeld's body of work that he did on the Oxbow. I don't know if any of you know that, that famous curve in the Connecticut River. He spent a couple of years photographing that. And so this idea of returning to a place to try to make pictures is something that this show is helping me kind of bridge into what I'm going to do next. But there's this other body of work, and then there are the glass houses, which are also in Connecticut. The glass house is a kind of microcosm. It's a laboratory that Philip Johnson used to explore different architectural ideas. And so I was privileged to be able to shoot there make a lot of pictures and then make these 2 videotapes, which are about a kind of walking, and they connect directly up to that very short 40-second film I made of walking up Harvest Hill. That a lot of my Super 8 films were involved walking, and that's why they're kind of boring, because who wants to look at walking for very long? But I think in the Glass House, I was able to combine the kind of diagrammatic space of the Lake Pavilion that Johnson built in 1963 with this kind of interest in a walking video. I think we should open it up for questions.
I was thinking the same.
Yeah, because
I just checked the time and it's 6:30.
Yeah.
So we've been yakking. Are there questions? Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fine, how are you? I was thinking about 2 phrases, and I wonder if we could maybe unpack them a little bit. So you were talking about newness in relation, newness and also the notion of killing idols. I'm curious about these terms, and thinking about the newness model seems to sort of inevitably lead to a culture of competition, and then the notion of killing one's idols in order to replace or substitute them with new ones, to me kind of creates a mythos that I don't understand how that can be sustained in this current economic context. I mean, how do these notions cohere with the realities of the art world, that is, and the educational models, and we're turning out hundreds and thousands of MFA students. Where are they to go? What are they to do? They're leaving school with extraordinary debt and just the possibility of precarious labor. And so I'm just wondering how
we need more state-supported schools. UCLA is relatively inexpensive.
So I'm just sort of wondering about this notion of originality, though.
Well, it's just, it's just
culturally sustain that.
I just thought I'd float that idea. It's like I retreated from that idea that maybe we don't need originality. And I was thinking, why not? I mean, originality in a limited sense. You have to discover, the process of making art is discovering things, and that's a kind of making things new. On the other hand, there's the obsession with the newness of, iPhone 5, or, there's this constant turnover in technology, and that's kind of wearying. But there is a, obsession with it. The culture is obsessed with that kind of newness. And I'm trying to separate what the activity, the non-economic activity of newness, of creation. Creation has to be something that's new, right? By definition. So it was just like thinking, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with innovation, the idea of innovation? Isn't that what we're teaching in art schools? It has to be. That's what thought is. Thought is, of course, the language is finite, and you put it together in new combinations. And so, I don't want to get too philosophical, but that's, I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at creation and newness. Of course, the idea of competition, well, that's a whole nother discussion, I think. But that's,
What
you should talk more about your ideas.
I was thinking about newness and how it could play out in more collaborative kinds of practices.
Oh, sure.
And not this notion of substituting one sort of movement in art with another. So, we have new topographics, and then after new topographics comes something else. And this sort of the notion of rejecting and substitution. And that language and vocabulary, I'm not really sure how we sustain that in this particular economic, cultural context. And are there some other models, and how do we cultivate those models in our MFA programs?
When I'm teaching now, and I'm teaching mostly at Hampshire, but I've taught at a couple of the other colleges as well, and ostensibly I'm teaching art history or contemporary art theory and criticism. And what I'm aware of is when I'm working with a class of students is that only a small percentage aspire to be artists. And so I have begun to frame how I think about this, and I'm getting to your economic question, that making art is one of the opportunities, but making culture is another opportunity. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of things you can do to make culture that matter. And immediately on that, for me, and this is just my own experience with contemporary art, especially since about the mid-'80s, is I've become as interested in art for what's sake and for whose sake, as well as for its own sake. So I don't dismiss art for its own sake, but I'm interested in art that meets the street, so to speak, and is socially engaged and is not just for the four white walls. And so when I talk about this with students now, I'm interested in how art fits into the world picture and not just into its own picture. I mean, that's my strategy at the moment.
I think I'm sitting here listening to you, and then I'm also able to sit and look at the work out there. And I'm sort of touched by this idea of that looking at photography, looking at these pieces, it's so much about seeing and how different that is than if I was looking at sculpture and painting. And there's a sense in which the artist is in a way like getting out of the way, but also showing something through seeing. I find that really, really touching, how there's this seeing of feeling that comes through with this photographic work. And how important it is for me, that notion of the sharing of seeing.
Well, that's kind of what art is. I mean, it's you know, the big sense is we're sharing our visions.
But it's different than when the artist's body, like a dancer, or when the writer with words, with that medium. There seems to me to be something in the immediacy that is qualitatively different than all other forms. Just my impression.
Yes?
You have watercolors. You are a photographer, so you have watercolor hanging here. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why they are hanging here?
I started, I started out as a watercolorist, and one of the things that watercolor shares with photography is its work on paper. I never liked working on canvas. I could never do it. I mean, I have a couple of oil paintings, and it was just like a miserable experience. I like paper. I like little things. I mean, I make bigger photographs now, but for a long time I've made miniature things. I mean, yes, these are paintings, and then in the other room they're photographs, but there's still this relationship. The way I think about it now, it's a relationship to works on paper. Maybe. And, you know, I didn't always think of myself as a photographer. I converted.
Other questions? Comments? Mirrors, messages, or manifestations?